an investigation that is bearing down on him, gets to name the person who is likely to be the swing vote in the court that will ultimately determine a big part of how any investigation goes forward.
We know a subpoena case is very likely involving Donald Trump to go to the United States Supreme Court, and I will ask a nominee to commit him or herself that they will recuse themselves from sitting on that decision.
If we are not going to thoroughly discuss what it means to have a president with this ongoing investigation happening, who is now going to be able to interview Supreme Court justices and potentially continue with his tradition of doing litmus tests, loyalty tests for that person, we could be participating in a process that could undermine that criminal investigation.
All right, to break down what's at stake in the president's next Supreme Court pick, I'm joined by Democratic Congressman Ted Lieu, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, and MSNBC Justice Analyst Matt Miller, former chief spokesperson for the Justice Department under President Barack Obama. Thanks to both of you gentlemen for being here with us on a Friday night. Congressman Lieu, let's start with you. The idea that the president isn't going to ask the nominee about Roe v. Wade may be secondary to the fact that this president couldn't hold back from asking people about loyalty in the investigation. That may be the biggest danger. Is he going to, in his interviews this weekend with one or two potential Supreme Court candidates, ask them about the investigation into him? And if he does that compromise a candidate?
Thank you, Ali, for your question. If he asks that question, I believe it absolutely compromises the candidate. I think a president under active criminal investigation should not be nominating a Supreme Court justice, and we should not be confirming a Supreme Court justice. But there's an equally compelling rationale for another reason why this shouldn't happen. I'll quote from Senate Leader Mitch McConnell during the Merrick Garland investigation, who said the American people should have a voice in the selection of the next Supreme Court justice. He held that vacancy open for 8 months. We've got elections in less than 5 months this November. We should wait till at least after November before looking at this issue.
Matt Miller, I want to just remind people of James Comey's testimony before the Senate Intel hearing on June 8th of 2017. This is an important piece of information that has now become newly relevant. Let's listen together.
My common sense told me that what was going on is either he had concluded or someone had told him that you've already asked Comey to stay and you didn't get anything for it. And that the dinner was an effort to build a relationship, in fact, he asked specifically, of loyalty in the context of asking me to stay.
Asked for loyalty in the context of asking James Comey to stay on as the director of the FBI. Matt, arguably, a Supreme Court justice is much more influential and for a longer time than the head of the FBI. So if the president was prepared to break with protocol and do things that people would think are at best unorthodox and unconventional and at worst obstruction of justice, and ask the head of the FBI for loyalty, there is some concern about what he will do at Bedminster when interviewing a prospective Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, absolutely there is. And you would think the staff would be smart enough to make sure there are people in the room with him. That dinner with Comey was famously one-on-one, and that they would warn him not to do something like that. But that doesn't mean that even outside of asking the direct question, that he wouldn't try other ways to ingratiate himself with this potential justice. I think the question here, that the principle that is so key here, is that, in our system of justice, no person is above the law. And that means no one gets to pick the prosecutor that investigates them if they're under investigation, and no one gets to pick the judge that hears their case. And it's especially important in this case because of the number of questions that could make it to the Supreme Court. I don't think the question of whether the president can be indicted will probably make it there, because I don't think DOJ will actually try to move forward with that. But there are other important questions, like, should the president be forced to submit to a subpoena if he's subpoenaed by the grand jury? Does he have the right to pardon himself, to execute a self-pardon? All of those things could make it to the Supreme Court. And you have to go back and remember that the president what he's under investigation for is obstruction of justice, for using his office to try to block the investigation into himself. That is the key principle, and that's why it's so important to be sure that he can't use his office here to try to thwart the investigation with a justice.
And ultimately, the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of this if it doesn't get settled otherwise. So, Congressman Lieu, Matt brings up an interesting point. The president never has to say anything about this to a Supreme Court justice. For that Supreme Justice possibly on any question of the investigation to be compromised. And that is what Senator Blumenthal has said, that he's going to ask these potential nominees, or whomever the nominee is, to whether they will recuse themselves if facing a question of the president's investigation.
They absolutely should recuse themselves. And let me just say, why is it that we have all these interesting constitutional issues under Donald Trump? It's because of his behavior. We're looking at these issues for the first time, such as, can the president pardon himself? Can the president be indicted? Why we even ask these questions? It's because Donald Trump is engaged in behavior that's way out of bounds for what a president should be doing, and he really should not be nominating a Supreme Court justice, and no Supreme Court justice should be confirmed until at least after a new Congress has been seated.
Congressman, probably most Americans have seen this exchange yesterday with the House Judiciary hearing with Rod Rosenstein. You were in that hearing. Rod Rosenstein was frustrated. He was frustrated by pressure from your Republican colleagues on him. But what do you make of the reporting now that Rosenstein is frustrated that the media and the White House have portrayed him in being pivotal in the firing of James Comey?
I agree that Rod Rosenstein has every right to be angry. The President of the United States should have told him he was going to fire Comey because of the Russia investigation, because the President told the whole world a few days after he did it that that's why he did it. Instead, he had Rosenstein write a memo, and then he used that memo as a fake cover story. He was using Rod Rosenstein, and I can certainly understand why Rod Rosenstein was angry about that.
Guys, thanks very much for joining me this evening, Congressman Ted Lieu and Matt Miller. All right, for more on whether the president should be able to nominate a Supreme Court justice while he's under investigation, I'm joined by former Democratic Senator Barbara Boxer of California, who now hosts the podcast Fight Back, and former Republican Congressman Mickey Edwards of Oklahoma. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here. I want to pick up right where we left off. Mickey Edwards, this is, as Congressman Lieu said, just a weird conversation that we're even having. But the fact is, it has been had before during President Nixon's term and the Watergate investigation. He had appointed 4 justices, all before the burglary, and Justice Rehnquist did recuse himself for having worked in the Nixon administration, even though there was no accusation of anything else there. So tell me, with this context, how you feel about this discussion.
Well, you know, first of all, I think not only whoever he nominates now and is elevated to the Supreme Court should recuse himself in any question about this investigation and whether or not the president is guilty of obstruction, collusion. But also, I think Justice Gorsuch should, too. He was also appointed by this president. And I think that, ordinarily you would say that that is not cause for them to recuse themselves. But in this case, where it's an investigation of the president directly, I think they should. I think this is a proper behavior.
So, Barbara Boxer, this is an interesting intellectual conversation. It's an interesting political conversation, and it's an interesting legislative conversation. But in the end, Republican leadership in the Senate, your former colleagues, aren't interested in having this discussion. They're not discussing whether or not they think Roe v. Wade should be challenged or overturned, or a different case like the one in Iowa brought up to have that discussion. They're certainly not discussing justices recusing themselves because of the investigation into Donald Trump. So politically, what do Democrats do about this?
Well, first of all, there's no surprise at the way they're acting. Whether these Republicans, and I say to my friend Mickey, how I long for Republicans like him, because he was an independent voice. But we have these lapdogs. They're all lapdogs for this president. They're scared to death of him because he's so popular with an increasingly right-wing base. And so that's why they don't want to talk about the reality that faces the American people. Allie, here's the thing. The Supreme Court is the last stop on the American justice train. There is nothing more important than this kind of appointment. It ought to be somebody who can pull more than 51 votes. It ought to be someone that can garner the respect of all sides, because every issue that America cares about, whether it's health care for their families, whether it's human rights, civil rights, who they can love and who they can marry, whether it's a woman's right to choose, does she have that respect? She has it now. Will she lose it? These are critical questions. But my Republican friends are hypocritical because, as we know, McConnell said clearly, let's wait 11 months and not allow Barack Obama to have his appointment. but he's silent on that issue. When it comes to Trump, we're going to rush it through, ram it through, and Trump gets to pick a juror on his trial.
So, Mickey, here's the thing. There may be no legislative or obviously political avenue in Congress for Democrats to do something about this, but there are marches. There is public opinion. We saw the influence public opinion had during Obamacare. It was close, but it actually worked. What can happen? Because to Barbara's point, the president is more popular than most Republican members of Congress or the Senate. And as a result, unlike in Nixon's era, unlike in Watergate, they didn't see the president they don't see the president today as an albatross.
You know, but this is really not just about Donald Trump. The constituents of these senators did not take an oath to support the Constitution. The senators did. And so the burden really is on the Republican. I totally agree with what Barbara has said about the behavior of the Republican senators to this point. And I think what we need now is marches help and demonstrations help. But we need people showing up at the offices of Republican senators, their constituents showing up and saying, here is where you show why you should or should not be a member of the United States Senate. This is now not about the president. This is about whether or not the United States Senate is going to fulfill its constitutional obligations to really vet a nominee and to make sure that any nominee who is elevated to the court is sworn to look, you know, fairly, impartially at the law and not do the bidding of whoever appointed him or her.
Barbara Boxer, when you were in the Senate, women senators were quite rare. They're still not all that plentiful, but the bottom line is there are a lot of references to women Republican senators who are being called upon to take a tough position to guarantee the rights of women as it pertains to Roe v. Wade. Do you think that's a fair burden, and do you think it's a necessary one?
It should be a burden on every senator, female or male, because Roe v. Wade protected women's lives, and through the Liberty Clause of the Constitution said we women have a right to privacy. If we are religious and our religion says no abortion, fine. If our religion says you can have some leeway or we don't practice any religion, fine. That's what a woman's right to choose is, and Roe gave us that choice. So I don't see this as a woman's issue. I see this as a human rights issue, as a civil rights issue, and as an issue that touches every single family. And this Senate and both sides of the aisle, all of them are responsible. And I do believe, because I did have Ed Markey on my podcast, thanks for mentioning it, he said he was going to use every single tool in the toolbox to stop this and slow it and drag it out. And you could be sure that right now there are closed-door meetings looking at that rule book and how we can slow this thing down until the American people get engaged in it.
Barbara Boxer, great to talk to you again. Thank you.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure, real quick.
Can I add one very quickly? And Roe v. Wade is a big issue here, but when you look at the travel ban, you look at tariffs, you know, this Supreme Court nomination is very important, very important.
Donald Trump himself said it. This is maybe the next 40 or 45 years of our future. He's right. Thanks to both of you, Barbara Boxer and Mickey Edwards. Great conversation.